My name is Avon, and for the longest time I believed that family meant comfort, loyalty, and the kind of love that never falters. But that illusion shattered on my 30th birthday when my parents handed me a suitcase and turned my milestone into a silent eviction. There was no thank you, no parting words, not even the courtesy of a proper goodbye, only a cold decree that I was too old to continue living under their roof. The cruel irony was that I had been the one paying their bills, covering their debts, keeping the lights glowing in a house that never truly felt like mine, and somehow all of that effort still wasn't enough to make me indispensable. The deepest wound wasn't the moment of being told to leave, though that cut sharply enough. It was the sudden recognition that I had been exploited for years, my loyalty drained in silence, and I had been too blinded by obligation to notice. When I finally dared to stand up for myself, when I chose to stop being their safety net, they did not relent, but instead sought to break me completely. That realization left me hollow, yet strangely focused, because betrayal has a way of clarifying what love never should have been. Before I go any further, I want to pause and ask you something simple. What time is it where you are, and from what place are you listening right now? Leave a comment below, because I read them all, and your own stories matter here as much as mine. Some storms in life are not meant to be endured endlessly. They aren't simply survived, they are outgrown, and in that growth you discover who you were always meant to be. I pulled into the fractured driveway just as the last of the daylight disappeared, and the small town of Ridgeway, Ohio, lay wrapped in a blue dusk that carried the first bite of autumn air, sharp enough to slip beneath my collar and make me shrink into myself. From the passenger seat, I lifted the only thing I had chosen for myself that day, a small cake box with vanilla frosting and "Happy Birthday, Avon," written at an awkward slant in red icing, the result of a weary teenager's hand that I had not bothered to correct. Stepping inside the house, the atmosphere felt wrong, not because I expected a celebration, those had ended years ago, but because the silence was heavier than usual, pressing down on me with an almost foreboding stillness. It wasn't as though I had been expecting a surprise party or even the formality of a card, because I had accepted long ago that my parents, Cullen and Vera, had no interest in celebrating me in any way. Birthdays had stopped mattering in this house years earlier, yet even with that in mind, there was something unnerving about the silence that hung in the air that night, a sterile stillness that felt heavier than anything I remembered before. It wrapped around me like a warning, pressing against my chest as soon as I stepped through the door. The kitchen lights hummed harshly above, throwing down a pale, merciless brightness over the table where dinner was already waiting. Meatloaf, canned beans, powdered potatoes. I hadn't even taken off my coat when Cullen's voice cut through the room from his place at the head of the table, barking at me with the irritation of someone rehearsing a grievance. His single phrase, "You're late," landed like a slap in the middle of the silence, reminding me where I stood in this household. I set the cake quietly on the counter, the plastic bag crackling louder than I meant as I replied in a flat, even tone that I had stayed late finishing reports. There was no apology in my voice, only a practiced neutrality. Vera remained wordless, eyes lowered, shifting her fork without touching her food, while Cullen dismissed me with a grunt and poured another inch of whiskey into a chipped glass that had long ago absorbed the smell of his habit. I slid my coat onto the hook and took a seat, feeling the weight of unspoken tension string itself across the room like spider webs. The ritual of dinner began in that suffocating quiet, punctuated by the scrape of knives against plates, the clink of glasses being lifted and set down, and the occasional cough meant to fill the void. There was no mention of my birthday, no gesture of acknowledgement, only the mechanical rhythm of chewing and swallowing that made the absence of love louder than any words could. I nudged a bland clump of potatoes across my plate with the tip of my fork, the heaviness in my chest warning me that something was building. Cullen was never the sort of man to sit quietly for long, and I should have sensed that a storm was about to break. His silence was never harmless. It was the pause before an inevitable strike. Midway through his meal, he slammed his fork against the table with such force that Vera flinched in her chair, the sound tearing through me like a jolt of electricity. He leaned back with a sneer, his eyes raking over me as though I were something spoiled left too long on the counter. His words came out with an icy precision, carefully rehearsed, almost as if he had practiced them. "You're too old to be freeloading. It's time you left." For a moment, the words seemed to hover in the air, too unreal to take shape. I blinked, then turned to Vera, desperate for a contradiction, some soft denial that might prove this was nothing more than one of Cullen's drunken tirades. But she refused to look at me, her lips pressed together until they blanched white, a picture of silent consent. I steadied myself and spoke evenly, almost clinically, listing the things I paid: the internet bill, the electricity, half the mortgage, the groceries. My voice never rose, never cracked, only plain facts laid bare like evidence spread on the table. Cullen responded with a sharp, mocking laugh that stung worse than a slap. "Paying a few bills doesn't buy you a lifetime stay, princess," he spat, twisting the nickname he once used tenderly when I was a little girl, climbing into his lap with scraped knees and messy pigtails. Now that same word was wielded like a blade, cutting away the last fragile illusion of safety I had carried. I swallowed against the ache in my chest, knowing this wasn't a sudden eruption. It was deliberate, prepared, and timed for maximum cruelty. My birthday had never been meant as a celebration. It had been chosen as a deadline. It was never a birthday. It was a deadline. I pushed the plate away, and the meatloaf, the untouched cake still in its bag, and the suffocating tension all pressed down on me like a stone lodged in my stomach. The air itself felt heavy, saturated with their judgment, and I realized there was nothing left to say that would change what had already been decided. I rose slowly, every movement deliberate, their eyes locked on me as though waiting for the outburst they thought would justify their cruelty. They wanted tears, pleading, some desperate display that would confirm their story of me as ungrateful and weak. But I refused to give them that satisfaction. I offered only a single sharp nod, final and unshakable, before speaking two simple words. "Got it." Cullen smirked with the smugness of a man convinced he had won some invisible game, while Vera shrank into herself, shame settling in the curve of her shoulders, but never strong enough to lift her voice in my defense. That silence was proof enough that I had been discarded. I walked toward the stairs, pausing only as my gaze fell on the cake still sitting in its bag on the counter. The plastic handle had stretched thin under the weight, cutting into the soft cardboard box, a quiet reminder of everything sagging and breaking beneath the surface. I picked it up carefully, though my heart wasn't in it, and something about the gesture felt absurd. Inside, one candle had come loose, a meaningless accident from the drive that suddenly felt like a cruel metaphor. One candle missing, one person missing, one family missing. I carried the small box up the creaking staircase without turning back, every step echoing like an accusation. When I finally shut my bedroom door, the hollow thud reverberated in my chest, and the truth settled heavily inside me. This house had never truly been mine. Maybe this house had never truly been mine at all. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, staring at the half-packed bags I had avoided finishing for weeks, as if leaving them undone might postpone the inevitable. Deep down, I had always known this day would arrive, not necessarily tonight, and not with such cruelty, but in time it was bound to happen. Part of me had foolishly believed I could outrun it by continuing to give more, to help more, to keep stitching together the pieces of a family that only took without ever offering back. I told myself I had more time, that I could somehow mend the cracks if I kept sacrificing, but the lie unraveled the moment they chose my birthday as the deadline. Slowly, I peeled off my jacket and folded it neatly across the suitcase, my motions calm, precise, almost mechanical. My hands didn't tremble, not because I wasn't hurting, but because something in me had already shut down. Pain had hardened into resolve, and that made me steady. As I gathered the few things I needed, my mind shifted into logistics like clockwork. Cancel the auto payments for every utility. transfer my checks into my own account, not the joint one my mother had insisted on under the guise of emergencies, secure a storage unit until I figured out the next steps. Each mental note was a small detachment from the invisible threads that had bound me to this place for too long. They hadn't only thrown me out tonight, they had also surrendered everything I had ever poured into them, years of money, effort, and unacknowledged loyalty. Outside my window, the wind rattled against the last stubborn leaves clinging to the maple branches, a sharp reminder that winter was closing in fast, and I would not be here when it arrived. When I zipped the suitcase shut, the sound cut through the stillness like a marker of finality. I caught sight of my reflection in the mirror, same brown hair gathered loosely into a bun, same green eyes dulled with exhaustion. Yet there was something unmistakably altered. A line had been drawn across my life, one I could never retreat from even if I tried. I sank back down onto the bed, the weight of everything pressing heavily into me. But this time, it wasn't the weight of despair. It was the gravity of change. The cake sat on my nightstand, looking absurdly small against the weight of the night. I hadn't even thought to buy candles, because who would have been here to light them, much less sing? The sugary smell of cheap frosting filled the room, cloying and nauseating as I stared at the crooked smear of red icing visible through the plastic window. Without a conscious thought, my hand moved, and I shoved the box from the table, letting it tumble to the floor. It landed with a muffled thud, cake and cardboard collapsing together on the worn carpet. "Happy birthday, Avon," I thought bitterly, the words echoing like a cruel joke. I sat at the edge of the bed, my room so silent it felt like a second skin pressing into me. The suitcase gaped half open on the floor, mocking my hesitation, while outside the wind whispered against the warped windows, rattling panes no one had bothered to fix. Even the house itself seemed to sigh under the weight of its own neglect. In that moment, I finally saw it clearly. Not a home, never really a home, but a place where I had been barely tolerated until I was no longer useful. My gaze dropped back to the cake, now crumpled and ridiculous, frosting smeared into the beige carpet like a child's failed hope, absurd and pitiful. The image struck me harder than I expected, a symbol of every small wish that had gone unanswered. I turned away, forcing my eyes instead to the dull gray suitcase resting by the wall. Its worn handle was slick from years of use, a silent record of how many times I had packed it in fear of leaving and then unpacked it again in surrender. Inside it weren't just clothes, it was the weight of every sacrifice I had made, every failure of theirs I had patched, every broken piece I had carried while my own had been left to rot. Memories surged up like a bitter tide, uninvited and merciless. I thought of the time Cullen cracked a molar during one of his drunken benders, the kitchen counter already crowded with late mortgage notices he had no plan to pay. He couldn't afford the surgery, so I quietly emptied part of the savings I had been building for my own place and covered it in cash. There was no thank you, no sign of gratitude, just a guttural grunt as he staggered back from the dentist, drooling and cursing all the way inside, as if my sacrifice had been nothing more than his due. Then came the winter when Vera's bald tires skidded across icy roads and she called me in a panic from outside town. I left work early, lost wages I couldn't spare, and bought her a brand new set along with paying for the tow. She patted my hand once, the faintest gesture of appreciation, calling me a good girl before sliding the repair bill toward me with the expectation that I'd cover that too. And when the roof began leaking last spring, it was me who climbed the ladder in the pouring rain, hammering shingles while Cullen sat inside with a beer, complaining about how you can't trust contractors these days. His daughter, the so-called freeloader, kept the house from collapsing around him. But none of those sacrifices ever mattered. None of them had earned me so much as a seat at their table tonight. The weight of that truth pressed down until I buried my palms into my eyes, forcing bursts of light to flash against the darkness, trying to contain the ache threatening to spill over. The sadness was still there, yes, but it had hardened, calcified into something colder, something less likely to shatter under the pressure. The floor creaked beneath me as I finally stood, my body moving with the steady resignation of someone who had already decided there was nothing left to salvage. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and descended the stairs, my steps instinctively soft, out of habit learned from years of trying not to disturb their fragile moods. In the living room, the glow of the television washed over them, casting their figures in an eerie blue light, as though they belonged to another world entirely, one I had never truly been a part of. Cullen slouched comfortably in his recliner, with a beer in hand, while Vera perched rigidly on the edge of the couch, her eyes glassy and far away. They looked perfectly at ease, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened, as if this night was just another Wednesday spent shoveling food into their mouths and blaming the world for their disappointments. I lingered in the doorway, waiting, though I wasn't sure what for, perhaps a crack in the silence, some acknowledgement that I existed beyond their convenience. A small, foolish part of me still clung to the fantasy that Vera might glance up, recognize what she was about to lose, or that Cullen might suddenly sober and recall who had kept the bills paid when the checks bounced. But hope, I realized, is a dangerous kind of poison, and tonight it had finally drained from me. Cullen's eyes caught mine first, and his lip curled into a sneer as he lifted the beer can lazily, his words slurred with mockery. "Don't forget to turn off the lights when you leave," he muttered. "You're not paying for them anymore." The cruelty in that casual dismissal struck harder than any hand could have, because it wasn't just about forcing me out of their house. It was about erasing every sacrifice, every quiet act of loyalty, every debt they had never acknowledged but had gladly consumed. In one sneer, they stripped away the years I had carried them, reducing it all to nothing. I gave them no answer. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I let silence absorb the last fragile piece of me that had once needed their approval. Turning away, I climbed the stairs slowly, each step weighted with more than the luggage waiting in my room. When I reached the top, I closed the door softly behind me and pressed my palm against the wood, as though sealing shut the part of myself that had still believed blood was the same as loyalty. For a long time, I stood there, breathing in the musty scent of worn carpet and stale memories, finally understanding how little this house had ever held for me. With steady hands, I slid my laptop from beneath the bed and placed it on the nightstand, my decision already made. If they believed they could discard me and still keep living on the crumbs I had been providing, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I lifted the lid, the familiar weight of it settling against my palms, and watched the screen glow to life, a pale, sterile light filling the room. My fingers moved quickly, almost by muscle memory. Years of bill payments, online transfers, and late-night balancing acts had trained me for this moment more thoroughly than I ever realized. One by one, I pulled up the accounts in my name: electric, water, gas, each one a quiet chain that had kept me tethered to this house. My finger trembled once before I pressed firmly on the cancel button. The electricity, gone. The water, gone. The gas, gone. Each click was a clean break, a cord snapping loose from my shoulders. The silence in the room deepened as I moved to the next task: the joint bank account my mother had always insisted we keep for emergencies. I shifted the remainder of my funds into the private account I had quietly opened months earlier, back when a faint voice inside me had whispered that this day would inevitably come. Transfer complete. That part of me, the part that had been bracing for abandonment, had been right all along. Finally, I turned to the luxuries they had used without a second thought: the cable and internet accounts, those daily lifelines they relied on mindlessly. They had never once realized it was my name on the bills, my paychecks fueling their endless scrolling and late-night marathons. One by one, I shut them down, the clicks echoing in my chest like small, precise strikes of justice. Cancel, cancel, cancel. Cancel. Each click became a quiet reclamation of power they had always assumed I lacked, and with every confirmation screen I felt another thread of their control unravel. My cursor hovered for a moment over the auto insurance, the last cord still tying me to them. Cullen's truck, Vera's dented Camry, both protected under my plan, a decision I had once justified as saving them a few $100s each month. I could almost hear Vera's syrupy voice from the year before, coaxing me with practiced sweetness. "You're so good with money, honey. It just makes sense." And yes, it had made sense, though only for them. With a steady breath, I clicked remove vehicle on each account, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with a grim satisfaction that had been too long denied. When the final account was severed, I shut the laptop with a soft, deliberate snap, and for the first time, the silence in my room didn't feel heavy. It felt lighter, sharper. This wasn't about revenge, nor was it about anger anymore. What I had done wasn't spite. It was balance. They wanted me gone, and that was their choice. But in cutting me out, they had also cut themselves off from the daughter who had quietly held their fragile world together with invisible thread. Now they would learn what it truly meant to lose me, not as a child or a burden, but as the only reason their lives had continued to function. Downstairs, the television kept playing, the hollow rhythm of a laugh track floating up the staircase as if mocking the emptiness in their lives. I sat there, imagining how long it would take before the lights flickered out, before the heater groaned its last breath, before the truth settled like a storm over their bubble of self-righteousness. I didn't plan to witness it. By the time morning came, I would be gone, leaving the wreckage they had built for themselves to collapse without me holding it together. But tonight was different. Tonight I began prying loose the first bricks from the fragile foundation they had so carelessly stacked on my back. The glow of the laptop screen dimmed as I leaned into it, my fingers hovering above the keys, steady and deliberate. Midnight was approaching, the house below me steeped in a silence that seemed peaceful on the surface, but pulsed with everything unspoken. Through the window, the oak trees whispered against the late autumn wind, carrying the brittle scent of dried leaves and the first murmurs of winter's arrival. I sat still for a moment, letting the ache in my body settle into the marrow of my bones. The truth was, I wasn't only tired from the weight of this single day, I was drained from years of carrying responsibilities that had never once been acknowledged. But exhaustion was a luxury I could no longer afford, not tonight. I cracked my knuckles softly, exhaled, and brought my focus back to the screen. The electricity bill came first, fittingly enough, since I had been the one listed as account holder ever since Dad forgot one winter and left us shivering for 2 days without heat. The login details slid easily into place, my memory trained by countless late nights fixing the messes they had left behind. Within seconds, I reached the payment section, my heart calm, my mind sharper than it had been in years. I removed the saved payment method and watched the confirmation flash across the screen, a clean severing of yet another tie. Water was next, the story much the same. I canceled the autopay, deleted my debit information, and felt a grim satisfaction settle in my chest. This wasn't simply about leaving, it was a surgical extraction, a methodical removal of myself from every vein that had kept this household alive while it drained me dry. Then came Netflix, a service they mindlessly enjoyed as though the monthly bill paid itself, and with one final click, I prepared to end even that small indulgence. I nearly laughed when the Netflix profiles appeared on the screen, dads, moms, even one optimistically labeled family movie night, though we hadn't shared an evening like that in almost a decade. I deleted the account with a single click. The internet service followed, cut cleanly. Cell phone plan add-ons vanished next. Finally, I unlinked my personal Amazon Prime account from the shared address. Each cancellation wasn't about revenge. It was about survival, about pulling myself out of the web where I had been trapped for years. These actions weren't fueled by anger, but by truth asserting itself through motion. After an hour of relentless clicking, I slid the laptop aside and reached into the nightstand for a yellow legal pad. I began writing out every account I had severed, each service that would grind to a halt when the morning sun rose over this crumbling house. The list grew longer with every stroke of the pen, a record of all the threads I had cut clean. I needed to see it written in ink, a final inventory of everything they had leaned on without acknowledgement, the countless things they had taken for granted. As I finished the last entry, a flood of memories poured through me, unwelcome but unstoppable. I saw myself working late nights, staying 2 extra hours at the office just to cobble together enough overtime to cover a surprise heating bill that should never have been my burden. I remembered vacations I had canceled so Vera could replace her failing alternator, birthdays I had let slip by because there was always something more urgent that required my money or my time. The pen pressed harder against the paper as I clenched it, forcing my hand to steady. Each memory was another reminder that what I had given had never been optional charity. It had been survival for them, paid for by the years I could never get back. This had never been about punishment. It was about finally refusing to be their safety net. As I scrolled through my banking app, my eyes landed on the emergency savings account I had set up years ago. At the time, I thought it was wisdom, a safeguard so our family would never again endure a winter without heat or a summer with the power shut off. In my naivete, I had built a lifeline not only for myself, but for them as well, because back then I still believed family meant sharing everything, even security. The account carried my name at the top, yet I had allowed them access, another concession offered in the name of loyalty. Tonight, with one tap, I froze it completely. No withdrawals, no transfers, no way for them to reach it. It would take weeks of paperwork and signatures before they could even attempt to regain control, and by then I would be long gone. When the confirmation screen blinked back at me, the knot that had been sitting in my chest began to ease at last. I had given them everything: money, time, loyalty, countless chances, and for the first time, I chose myself. Just then, a new notification slid across the screen. Tyler, my cousin, had sent me a meme, a cartoon dog surrounded by flames saying, "This is fine." No words, no explanation, just that small, bleak attempt at humor that told me he understood more than he said. I let out a humorless laugh. Tyler, for all his flaws, always seemed to know when something was unraveling, when silence itself was heavy enough to speak. I considered writing back but stopped myself. He was blood, yes, but he wasn't part of this rot, and some bridges needed to collapse without witnesses. Instead, I opened a blank email draft and typed the subject line with mechanical precision. "You asked me to leave. Now, so has my support." My fingers hovered above the keys, the words stark and final, the message I would never actually send but had already made true with my actions. I stared at the blinking cursor, my fingers suspended above the send button, heart pounding once, twice, before I finally closed the tab. They didn't deserve an explanation. What they deserved was the same silence they had offered me tonight, the emptiness that had replaced love in this house long ago. The laptop clock flicked over to 1:57 a.m. as the walls creaked and shifted around me, the old house settling into its bones. Somewhere below, a bottle clinked faintly in the sink, and I could almost see Vera sitting stiffly on the couch with her wine, eyes glazed at the glow of reruns, pretending nothing at all was about to collapse around her. The heater rumbled to life, its mechanical groan vibrating up through the floorboards, and I realized it would likely be the last cozy night they enjoyed for some time. I scrolled back through each account and each confirmation, double-checking the cancellations, the freezes, the disconnections, methodical and exacting. Every piece was set to go into effect at sunrise, as precise as clockwork. Neat, clean, irreversible. That was the tally of my work. By tomorrow morning, when Cullen flipped the switch, expecting the kitchen light, or shoved his mug into the microwave for his daily coffee, he would find nothing but darkness. And when Vera slid the joint card across the grocery counter, it would decline, the cashier's stare cutting through her pretense. By the time her internet sputtered out mid-episode, the reality would settle in. They would know. They would feel the weight of my absence in every small convenience they had always taken for granted. I didn't smile, not even a little, because there was nothing joyful about it, only truth delivered exactly as it needed to be. I didn't cry. What I felt instead was a hollow emptiness, but it was the kind of emptiness that hinted at possibility, a space that might one day be filled with something better. At 2 a.m., I closed the laptop with a soft click, leaned back in the chair, and watched the shadows dance across the ceiling. My bag was packed. My car, parked 2 blocks away to avoid suspicion, already held the essentials I would need to begin again. Tomorrow, I told myself, I would leave this town behind. I would walk away from this collapsing shell of obligation and resentment, and by the time morning came, they would awaken to a life stripped of the daughter they had discarded so carelessly. But when daylight filtered weakly through the cheap blinds of Nora's apartment, it wasn't freedom that greeted me first. It was my phone, buzzing furiously against the nightstand. Half asleep, I pulled the covers closer, clinging for a moment to the irrational hope that it was a wrong number. A quick glance at the screen erased that illusion. 12 missed calls lit up the display. Vera, Cullen, a scattering of unfamiliar numbers that had to be neighbors or extended family, already recruited into their campaign. I didn't listen to the voicemails. I couldn't. I just stared at the screen, a knot of emotions tightening in my chest until guilt tried to claw its way forward. I forced it down. They had made their choice. Flipping onto my back, I opened Tyler's message first. It was blunt, the way he always was. Internet's down. No lights. Dad's furious. Mom crying. I let the phone slide from my hand and fall onto the mattress, my eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling above, the truth settling heavy but certain. It had begun, and for once I wasn't rushing in to patch it back together. Not this time. A new notification chimed across the silence. This one, a voicemail. Curiosity edged past my resolve, and I pressed play on speaker as I pulled a sweater over my shoulders. Vera's voice came through, soft and trembling, the practiced quiver of someone trying to sound broken. "Avon, honey, there must be some mistake. You wouldn't just leave us like this. Please call me. We can fix whatever's wrong. We're family." I closed my eyes, letting those words hang in the stale air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. How quickly Freeloader had turned back into family the moment the Wi-Fi flickered out. The irony was sharp enough to sting, and before the thought could fade, another chime buzzed against the nightstand. This time, it was a text from Cullen. "You'll regret turning your back on your family." No softness, no hesitation, just rage sharpened into a single line. I silenced the phone and turned it face down, the screen still vibrating faintly as if it could claw its way back into my attention. Nora appeared then, shuffling into the living room with 2 mugs of coffee, hair tousled from sleep, an oversized hoodie slouched across her shoulders. She didn't speak at first, just handed me one of the mugs before lowering herself to the floor beside the bed. For a moment we sat in silence, sipping from the steaming cups, the bitterness grounding me. Then she tilted her head toward me, her voice low but edged with calm humor. "You look like someone just told you your winning lottery ticket expired." The remark tugged a short, humorless laugh out of me, the only sound I could muster against the absurd weight pressing down on the room. "They're panicking," I said quietly, the words simple, almost detached. Nora rested her head back against the wall, her knees tucked to her chest, her voice steady as she replied, "Good." Then, softer, she added, "Sometimes it's not betrayal to save yourself, it's survival." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the faint rumble of a garbage truck passing outside, the sound oddly grounding against the weight of everything unspoken. That afternoon, we walked together to a community event at the local church, the annual Autumn Festival, filled with the predictable charms of small-town life, pies cooling on folding tables, rows of pumpkins lined for sale, booths offering candles and trinkets. I kept to the edges, preferring anonymity, but it didn't take long for the whispers to weave their way toward me. Cullen was there too, and it wasn't hard to find him. He stood near the apple-bobbing booth, his voice lifted just enough to carry across the crowd, full of false indignation. "My daughter abandoned us," he barked, "after everything we sacrificed for her. Kids these days. No loyalty, no gratitude." Heads turned as his words spread like smoke. Some nodded, sympathy flickering across their faces, but others exchanged skeptical glances. It wasn't the first time Cullen had aired his grievances in public, and memories of his past behavior lingered in the community. Nora noticed before I did that I had started drifting toward him, her hand brushing my arm as she murmured, "Don't." I forced myself to stop, to breathe, to let him rant without giving him what he wanted, an audience. Instead, I moved slowly past the booths, catching fragments of conversations as I went. "Didn't her daughter pay their bills for years?" someone whispered. "Wasn't she the one who stayed home when the mom was sick?" Another voice chimed in. "Funny how now she's suddenly the villain." The tide, subtle but steady, was shifting. The tide was shifting, subtle but undeniable, like an unseen current drawing power away from my parents' grip. Cullen and Vera could twist their story however they pleased, but cracks had begun to show, and in a town like ours, memories ran deep. By that evening, back at Nora's place, I was scrolling through a steady stream of texts from friends, snapshots of the house with the porch light dark, newspapers piling unread, and word of Cullen losing his temper at an electric company rep in front of half the neighborhood. It wasn't their cruelty that shamed them, it was the fact they could no longer conceal it. As the sun dipped behind the familiar rooftops, painting long purple shadows over the quiet streets, I stood at Nora's window and watched the town slide into night. Somewhere not far away, the house that had drained every ounce of my patience and devotion was fading into darkness, its lights flickering out one by one. This time, I didn't feel the pull to fix it, to save it from collapsing under its own neglect. I let the darkness come. The house went dark, and with it, a part of me finally extinguished as well. Yet outside, the world carried on unbothered. Morning arrived, people went to work, dogs barked at passing mailmen, children giggled at the bus stop as though nothing monumental had shifted. Life did not stall simply because mine had been torn open. It moved on, indifferent, steady. 3 days passed in a blur of trying to piece together something resembling a new normal. I filled my hours with the smallest of tasks, anything to stave off the weight of silence. I sorted through the scattered documents on Nora's kitchen table, scrubbed down the bathroom we shared until it gleamed, and reworked my resume again and again, as though polishing words on a page could anchor me to the future I was still struggling to imagine. I busied myself with meaningless chores, desperate to keep my hands moving so my mind wouldn't circle back to them, but thoughts are stubborn and intrusive. By mid-morning, my phone buzzed, that familiar vibration rattling against the table and sending my heart into my ribs. I almost ignored it, almost let it pass into silence, but curiosity broke me. The message was from Vera. "After everything we did for you, this is how you repay us? Dad's health is failing. He hasn't eaten in 2 days." I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, the phone suddenly heavy in my grip, my stomach twisting into knots. The guilt cut sharp and immediate, as though it had been lying in wait just beneath my skin. I collapsed onto the worn couch, reading the words over and over until they blurred together. Unbidden, old images resurfaced, birthday parties with homemade cakes, late-night conversations in the living room, laughter spilling over burnt Thanksgiving turkeys. Memories that didn't fit with the people they had become, yet they felt vivid and real in that moment. What if they really were suffering? What if I was punishing them too harshly? The guilt slithered deeper with every passing hour, coiling around me no matter how much I tried to shake it loose. Vera's message wasn't the end of it. Soon the calls began to trickle in, each one pressing harder against the cracks in my resolve. Relatives I barely spoke to suddenly felt justified in lecturing me. Aunt Marcy's syrupy voice crooned through one voicemail, reminding me that my father's heart wasn't strong. Uncle Phil's text insisted that families fight, but cutting ties so completely was cruel, urging me to think of my mother. One by one, their words layered over Vera's, each designed to grind down what little strength I had left. "She's fragile. This could kill her." Each new message hammered deeper into the cracks already spreading through my resolve. Doubt crept in like a slow poison. Maybe I was heartless. Maybe I was the villain in this story. Maybe all of it really was my fault. My phone buzzed again before the thought could fully take root. It was from Tyler. His text was short, blunt, and merciless. Dad told Mom to fake chest pains next if guilt-tripping you doesn't work. I stared at the words until the weight of them pressed the air from my lungs. The truth landed with brutal clarity. This had never been about reconciliation, never about understanding or accountability. It was strategy, manipulation dressed up as desperation. So that was their plan. They didn't miss me. They missed what I could provide. Not love, not presence, just the utility of what I could fix, fund, or carry. My chest felt hollow, not from grief anymore, but from the realization that their desperation was never about me at all. Numb, I tossed the phone onto the coffee table and curled into myself on the couch. Sunlight shifted slowly across the floor, stretching golden fingers over Nora's second-hand rug as the hours crept by. I didn't resist the weight pressing down on me this time. I let it sink in fully. The years of bending myself backward for people who had only ever seen me as their safety net. The quiet sacrifices, the endless giving, the desperate hope that one day it would be enough to earn me a place at a table that had never truly been mine. All of it settled inside me, no longer as sadness, but as something colder, sharper, unbreakable. I stayed motionless until Nora came home from her shift at the clinic, her sneakers squeaking faintly across the hardwood. "You okay?" she asked as she set her bag down by the door. I gave a single, deliberate nod. For the first time in a long time, it was the truth. After she drifted into the kitchen, I reached for my phone and began scrolling through my contacts. Cullen, Vera, Aunt Marcy, Uncle Phil. Every cousin and distant relation who had found the time to scold me, but never once asked how I was surviving. One by one, I pressed delete. Slowly, without haste, without tears, I erased them. When the list was cleared, I went into my settings and blocked every number tied to that house, that family, that false sense of belonging I had carried like a weight. It wasn't rage that guided my hand. It was mercy, mercy for myself, for the girl who had carried their burdens far too long. When it was finished, I placed the phone face down on the table and drew in a long, steady breath, the kind that filled my lungs in a way I hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow would bring new battles. I wasn't naive enough to believe severing them from my life would end everything, but tonight I had claimed a small, hard-won victory. I had taken back a piece of myself, and yet, as I set the phone aside and waited for chaos to fall away, like a heavy coat shrugged from weary shoulders, only silence remained. It was not peace, not yet, but a fragile, eerie quiet, as though even the world outside was pausing, holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do next. The first few days passed quietly, slipping by in small, steady rhythms that felt almost ordinary. I helped Nora reorganize her cramped apartment, sent out applications for jobs in nearby towns, even cooked us dinner a few times. They were small gestures, but they felt like tiny footholds on the climb back towards something resembling normal life. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe I had outrun the wreckage they'd tried to leave lodged inside me. But peace never lasted long. It was a Thursday morning, the kind where the autumn chill seeped easily through the thin windows, wrapping the room in a damp cold. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping weak coffee from one of Nora's chipped mugs, when my phone buzzed across the wood surface. Expecting another polite job rejection, I picked it up, only to see a message from Carrie, an old coworker I hadn't heard from in months. "Hey, you seen what your dad posted?" her text read. My stomach knotted as I tapped the link, curiosity and dread colliding. In seconds, the screen filled with it, Cullen's words plastered across the local town's Facebook group, raw and venomous, spread wide for anyone to see. Some daughters are raised to be grateful, some turn into snakes. After everything we sacrificed, our daughter left us sick, starving, abandoned. His accusations burned against my screen like acid, not just lies, but deliberate poison meant to corrode whatever reputation I had left. The wreckage I thought I'd escaped had simply followed me into the open, dressed up as his truth, and delivered to the town like gospel. Pray for us. That was how Cullen had ended his post, and already more than 100 comments trailed beneath it. Some were filled with prayers and pity, but others, many from people I barely knew, were sharp, merciless stones flung straight at me. "Ungrateful brat," one read. "Parents give you life and you spit on them?" Another sneered. My hand shook so hard I nearly dropped the phone. From across the kitchen, Nora caught my expression, her brows knitting together. "Bad?" she asked softly. I couldn't even form the words, only pressed the screen tight against my chest, as if it could muffle the ache rising inside me. By noon, the wildfire had spread everywhere. Friends who still cared sent me screenshots, warning me how far it had gone. Neighbors, distant cousins, even teachers I hadn't seen in years were chiming in, their comments dripping with judgment. Always knew something was off with that girl. Each one was another spark, feeding the fire my parents had set, and I could feel it licking at the edges of the fragile life I was trying to build. Nora sat down across from me, her eyes steady, her voice calm but edged with steel. "They're writing your story for you. Are you really going to let them?" The question settled inside me like a stone dropping into water, ripples spreading out in every direction. Number not, this time. I wouldn't let them define me with their poison. With a sharp breath, I shut off my phone and reached for the drawer where I kept the folder, my insurance, my truth. Inside was my record, carefully kept through the years, receipts, emails, screenshots, bank statements, proof of the thousands of dollars I had funneled into that house, into those people, without ever asking for anything in return. Electric bills in my name, mortgage payments from my account, repairs covered by my overtime shifts. They had long since forgotten the cost, because they had never borne it, but I hadn't. For hours I worked methodically, scanning and organizing, turning memory into evidence. By evening, I had built an arsenal, a fortress of truth, sharp and undeniable. Nora peeked into the room, her voice low and careful. "You gonna post it?" she asked. I looked up from the laptop, shaking my head slowly. "Not yet," I answered. Let them talk a little longer, let them dig deeper into their own lies. The more they spoke, the clearer their true selves would become, and the more the town would see through the performance. Because I understood something Cullen and Vera had never counted on. I wasn't storming into battle with blind anger anymore, lashing out like some wounded creature. I was steady now, deliberate. Patience was my weapon, and strategy was my shield. They had underestimated me for years, but this time I was letting them reveal themselves before I struck. Our town thrived on gossip, but it also collapsed quickly when the truth surfaced. All I had to do was wait for the crack to widen, for their story to swell beyond credibility and topple under its own weight. And when that moment arrived, I wouldn't need to shout or beg or defend. A few facts, simply laid out, would be enough to undo them completely. That evening, Nora and I sat together on the couch with plates of leftover spaghetti, her fork raised toward me like a toast. "To survival," she said. I managed a faint smile, lifting my own fork to meet hers. "To never apologizing for saving yourself." Later, lying awake in the quiet of the spare bedroom, I let Cullen's words replay in my mind, no longer cutting but hollow, echoing only as reminders of the battle still to come. Some daughters are raised to be grateful. Cullen's words echoed, and in a way, he wasn't wrong. I had been grateful even as they starved me emotionally, drained me financially, erased me piece by piece until there was little left. But that part of me was gone now. By the time sleep finally claimed me, I wasn't simply enduring their lies anymore. I was preparing to bury them beneath the truth they never believed I would have the courage to expose. The decision was made. There would be no turning back. The next morning, I sat at Nora's small dining table, laptop open, heart pounding hard, but my hands steady. The apartment smelled faintly of old coffee and the damp trace of last night's rain, ordinary scents clashing with the extraordinary weight of what I was about to do. Every nerve in my body told me this moment mattered. Every sacrifice, every humiliation had brought me here. Carefully, deliberately, I built the thread. It wasn't written in rage or desperation, but in calm precision. First came screenshots of utility payments, electric, water, internet, all in my name, stretching back years, each one stamped with clear dates. Next were bank statements showing mortgage payments pulled directly from my account, even in months when Cullen's paycheck had been more than enough to cover the costs. Then I uploaded emails exchanged with the landlord, records verifying the repairs I had paid for, repairs that had kept the roof from caving during Ohio's brutal winters. At the end, I added a simple timeline: the vacations I canceled, the birthdays I let slip by, the small pieces of life I gave up to keep their world from collapsing. And when the evidence stood complete, I ended it with a single, final statement. When they asked me to leave, they didn't just lose a daughter. They lost the person who kept the lights on when they weren't looking. I hit post. For a long breath, there was only silence, the faint hum of Nora's fridge filling the stillness like white noise. Then my phone began to buzz, tentative at first. A few likes, a handful of shocked comments, private messages from old classmates whispering the same refrain. I always wondered why you stayed so long. And then it shifted, momentum rushing like a dam bursting. Dozens of shares turned into hundreds of comments, voices rising from every corner of town. Neighbors, former teachers, even people I had nearly forgotten began to weigh in. One neighbor wrote, "I remember seeing her out there, shoveling the driveway alone at 16, while her parents shouted from the porch." Another added, "Cullen used to brag he never paid a cent toward bills once Avon got a job." Their words poured out like old wounds breaking open, stories long kept quiet finally spilling into the light. It became clear that people had noticed far more than I ever believed. They had seen the cracks, heard the cruelty, watched the way I carried burdens no daughter should have borne. They had stayed silent, perhaps out of politeness, perhaps out of fear, but once the truth was named aloud, they no longer hesitated to speak. Each comment was another stone stacked on the wall of evidence, another thread woven into the tapestry of my defense. Meanwhile, Cullen and Vera scrambled. Cullen struck first with a brittle, angry post. "We all have misunderstandings in families. My daughter exaggerates things for sympathy. Sad, really." But the words fell flat, brittle against the tide of truth already rolling over them. The comment section beneath his defense turned sharp and unsympathetic. No one was buying the story anymore. "Funny how you never posted about her paying your bills until now," someone commented sharply beneath Cullen's furious defense. Another added with brutal honesty, "You don't look too sick cashing her checks." The tide had fully turned, and their excuses no longer held weight. Then Vera tried a new tactic. My inbox filled with voicemails, her voice trembling with practiced pity. "Avon, please, your father isn't well." I didn't know he was going to post that. "This is all a huge misunderstanding. Please take it down before people think badly of us." There had been a time when that pleading tone would have cut me open, when I would have rushed to soothe, to mend, to protect them from the consequences of their own choices. But not anymore. I understood now that her words weren't born of regret. They were born of fear of reputation, not of losing me. Her desperation wasn't for reconciliation, but for control. And that knowledge gave me strength I hadn't realized I carried. That afternoon, Nora and I walked together to the fall festival in the town square. The crisp air carried the scents of caramel apples and hay, children's laughter rising from the bounce houses, while the old brass band tuned their instruments by the courthouse steps. The second I stepped onto the cobblestones, I felt eyes turn toward me. But this time it wasn't hostile, wasn't judgment sharpened into knives. It was something softer, something almost mournful, as if the town itself was reckoning with truths it had ignored for too long. As we moved past the booths, Mrs. Langford, my old elementary teacher, met my eyes and offered a small, sad smile. Mr. Collins from the hardware store tipped his cap wordlessly, the gesture quiet but weighted. And then, near the pumpkin carving station, a woman I barely knew, one of Vera's old church friends, stepped forward. Her hand rested gently on my shoulder, and her voice carried the kind of kindness I had craved for years. "You deserved better, sweetheart," she said softly, and in that moment, I finally believed it. We all knew. We were just too afraid to say it. Her words clung to me, tears pricking at the back of my eyes, though I forced them down. I nodded, murmuring a quiet thank you that felt far too small for the weight of what she had given me. Standing there, in the center of the community where I had once felt invisible, clarity struck sharp enough to sting. The shame had never been mine to carry. It had been theirs all along. As the afternoon gave way to dusk, strings of fairy lights glowed across the square, and the air filled with the scent of roasted corn and kettle popcorn. Children shrieked with laughter near the games, music wound its way through the crowd, and for once I didn't feel like a shadow pressed to the edges. I belonged, not to them, not to their approval, but to myself. The realization was fragile and fierce all at once. Later that night, fireworks exploded above the courthouse lawn, red and gold streaks tearing open the sky. I tilted my head back and stood still beneath it, letting the booming echo vibrate through my chest. A quiet voice whispered inside me, reminding me that sometimes the brightest displays only arrive after the darkest storms. And for the first time, I wasn't running from the wreckage anymore. I was rising from it, claiming the light as my own. Back at Nora's apartment, the smell of burnt leaves drifted through the night air as I leaned against the window frame, watching the small town settle under another cool autumn sky. Life outside moved as though nothing had shifted, steady, unremarkable, while mine still balanced precariously on the edge of another battlefield. 2 days had passed since I had posted the truth, and I had almost allowed myself to believe it was over, that silence might finally serve as the last word between us. Then came the knock, not frantic, not angry, just a polite, almost sheepish rap against the door that sent unease crawling up my spine. I glanced at Nora, who lowered her coffee mug slowly, her brow furrowing in silent question. Crossing the small living room, I pulled the door open to find a uniformed officer waiting, a large manila envelope in his hand. "Miss Avon Marin?" he asked, voice steady and detached. "Yes," I replied, though a knot was already tightening in my stomach. He placed the envelope in my hands. "You've been served. Civil suit. Any questions, the contacts are listed inside." His tone never wavered, professional and final. I thanked him out of reflex, closed the door with a soft click, and stared down at the package like it might bite. I didn't need to open it to know where it had come from, but I sat at the kitchen table anyway, sliding a finger under the flap until the papers spilled out across the wood. Cullen had filed a lawsuit against me. The charges might have been laughable if they weren't so cruel. Theft, emotional elder abuse, financial abandonment. It was nothing more than a tantrum dressed in legal language, another attempt to claw back control. Nora leaned over my shoulder, scanning the page, her voice tight with disbelief. "Unbelievable. They're trying to destroy you because you walked away." For a moment, the familiar guilt flared hot and sharp, like an old wound ripped open. The voice I'd grown up with whispered insidiously, "Maybe you're making too much of this. Maybe you should have just stayed quiet." But that voice no longer held the power it once had. I inhaled deeply, steady and slow, anchoring myself in the truth I had already laid bare. For the first time, I felt the ground beneath me hold firm. "Not this time," I said aloud as I rose from my chair, the words steady, final. "I'm done apologizing for saving myself." By noon, I was on the phone with a legal aid office in Columbus, explaining everything carefully, point by point. I forwarded the folder of evidence I had already compiled, every receipt, every bank transfer, every documented act of support stretched across years. They listened closely, asked deliberate questions, then assured me they could help prepare a countersuit if it came to that. "You have a strong case," the paralegal told me, "and honestly, it sounds like you should be the one suing for exploitation." Their words lingered long after the call ended. I didn't crave revenge. Vengeance had never been the goal. What I wanted was simple. I wanted my life back. So that afternoon, I followed their guidance and filed my own formal complaints, detailing years of financial manipulation carried out under the constant pressure of guilt. Elder abuse, I learned, didn't flow only in one direction. It also applied when adult children were drained of labor and money under threats of shame and obligation. The response came faster than I expected. Vera was the first to call, her voice trembling with the kind of grief that felt rehearsed. "Avon, please," she pleaded. "You're tearing this family apart. We only wanted what was best for you. You're overreacting. You know your father's not well." Her tone wavered between sorrow and accusation, searching for the crack in me she used to know. I let the phone ring in my hand, silent, unanswering. An hour later, another notification buzzed across my screen, this time from Cullen. His message was short, seething, a final poison dart meant to wound where her pity could not. "You think you won. Family always gets the last word." Cullen's text glared up from the screen, the letters swimming as anger and pity collided inside me. For a long moment, I just stared, my pulse loud in my ears, until I finally set the phone aside and opened the small drawer beside my bed. Wrapped carefully in a tissue lay the tiny plastic cake topper I had bought for myself on the night of my 30th birthday, the birthday they had turned into an eviction. A single candle, a broken memory. I turned it over in my hand, marveling at the absurdity of how much hope I had once packed into something so cheap and meaningless. In the quiet room, I whispered the truth I had come to carry. Family isn't who you're born to, it's who treats you like you matter. The words settled into the air like a vow. 2 days later, I stood outside the police station, legal papers clutched tight, a volunteer advocate from the aid office at my side. The building was gray and square, no more intimidating than a post office, yet the weight of what it represented pressed hard on my shoulders. Inside, Cullen sat rigid at a battered wooden table, Vera beside him, her fingers knotting anxiously around the strap of her handbag. They looked smaller than I remembered, angrier, yes, but weaker too, as if their power had drained away the moment truth stood against them. The officer spoke evenly, laying out the reality neither of them wanted to hear. If they pursued their false charges, they risked countersuits for defamation and financial abuse, charges that could and likely would stick given the evidence I carried. Cullen's face reddened until it looked ready to burst, and with a furious shove, he sent his chair screeching back against the floor. "This is a witch hunt," he barked, jabbing a finger toward me. "She's manipulating everyone." His words rattled the walls, but for the first time, they carried no weight. No one answered Cullen's outburst. His words hung in the air, empty, while Vera collapsed into her chair, sobs spilling out so loud they echoed against the cinderblock walls. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. As they finally stormed out, the officer turned to me, his voice quiet but certain. "You did the right thing. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Outside, the sun was startlingly bright against the cool autumn sky. I paused on the steps, letting the warmth soak into my skin, the courthouse standing solid behind me while the whole town stretched open ahead. The air smelled crisp, sharp with the scent of dry leaves, carrying the strange blend of endings and beginnings all tangled together. With each step away from that building, I could feel the weight I had carried for decades growing lighter. No more explanations, no more guilt, no more apologies. Each phrase beat steady in my chest like a drum as I crossed the parking lot. A sudden gust of wind swept across the pavement, scattering leaves around my boots in a restless swirl. It felt as if the world itself was brushing away the last remnants of a life that had never truly been mine to hold. The courthouse shrank in my rearview mirror as I guided the car onto the main road. The windows rolled down to let the crisp fall air pour through the cabin like a baptism. For the first time in years, longer than I cared to measure, my heart didn't feel like it was dragging a boulder behind it. It beat free, unburdened, steady with the rhythm of survival turning at last into something that looked like hope. No one replied to Cullen's accusations. His fury dissolved into silence, leaving only Vera's sobs, loud and jagged, bouncing off the cinder block walls as she collapsed into her chair. I didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't speak. I didn't have to. When they finally stormed out, the officer turned toward me, his voice low but steady. "You did the right thing. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Outside, sunlight struck the world with startling clarity against the cool autumn sky. I paused on the courthouse steps, letting its warmth sink into me, the courthouse heavy at my back, the town sprawling ahead. The air smelled crisp and alive, a mingling of endings and beginnings that cut clean through the haze of everything I had carried. With each step away from that building, the burden I had held for decades loosened its grip. No more explaining, no more guilt, no more apologies. The words pulsed through me as I crossed the parking lot, steady as a heartbeat. A gust of wind rose suddenly, sweeping fallen leaves into a swirl around my boots. It felt as though the world itself was reaching down to brush away the last shreds of a life that had never truly belonged to me. In the rearview mirror, the courthouse grew smaller and smaller until it was just another building fading into distance. I rolled the windows down and let the autumn air pour through the car like a baptism, washing the last traces of their hold from me. For the first time in longer than I could remember, my heart no longer dragged a weight behind it. It beat freely, steady and unburdened, carrying me toward a life that, finally, felt like mine. No phone vibrating with guilt-soaked voicemails. No texts demanding apologies I didn't owe. No more breaking myself apart in a desperate attempt to stitch together a family that had never truly included me. For the first time, I was free. Yet freedom, I discovered, was quieter than I had imagined. I spent the following days in Nora's apartment, slipping into the rhythm of small, ordinary routines, making coffee, folding laundry, walking down to the corner store for milk. Simple tasks, but each one felt like a revelation when done without glancing over my shoulder, without bracing for a command, barked across the room, or a bill shoved into my hand as proof of a debt I could never repay. The ordinary became precious, and in its simplicity, I finally felt the contours of peace. One morning, while sitting at the tiny kitchen table with my laptop open, I stumbled upon an ad for a modest rental unit downtown. The description was plain, the building older, with creaky floors and drafty windows. But it was available, and most importantly, it would be mine. For the first time in a long time, I wanted something just for myself. By noon, I had signed the lease. I told no one but Nora, who smiled as she pressed a chipped coffee mug into my hand. "To new beginnings," she said softly. "To finally choosing myself," I answered. The weeks that followed blurred into a soft, golden rhythm as I pieced together a home from second-hand finds, a couch with sun-faded cushions, a wobbly kitchen table that had clearly served another family before me, each object a symbol of a life I was building on my own terms. I painted the walls a soft pale blue, the color of open skies and deep breaths. At night, I would sit by the single living room window, watching the town lights flicker like distant stars, and somewhere between one breath and the next, I realized the silence no longer felt hollow. It felt earned. One Saturday, while unpacking the last of my boxes, I found it buried at the bottom, a relic from another life. The tiny plastic cake topper, the one from the birthday that had ended everything. I held it in my hand for a long while, the late afternoon sun catching on its cheap, bent edge. But it didn't wound me anymore. It didn't feel like something lost. It felt like proof of what I had endured and survived. I set it gently on a shelf above my desk, not as a reminder of the people who had tried to break me, but as a small private trophy for the girl who refused to let them succeed. Weeks later, a card slipped under my door with no return address. Inside was a note in careful handwriting. "You were never the problem. Some people just fear the ones they can't control. I never discovered who sent it, and I didn't need to, because by then I already knew the truth, the final truth. Family isn't something you buy with sacrifice. It isn't a currency to be earned or bargained for. It is something given freely, or it doesn't exist at all. And in the empty space their absence left behind, I was building something far more valuable than their approval, something they could never take from me: peace, self-respect, a life stitched together not from obligation or fear, but from choice. As I sat by my window that night, the city lights glowing softly below, I smiled quietly and whispered the words I had spent my entire life waiting to believe: I am enough. Sometimes the only way to become who you were meant to be is to walk away from the people who raised you. Blood may tie us together, but respect, trust, and kindness are what truly make a family. And when those things are absent, stepping away isn't betrayal, it's survival. Have you ever been in that place where putting yourself first meant letting go of everything you thought you couldn't live without? Moments like that change you forever. Tell me your story down in the comments. I'd truly love to read it. And if this journey spoke to something inside you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because around here, every story deserves to be heard. Stay strong, stay true, and remember, family drama doesn't define who you are. It's how you rise above it that does.